The gold-embossed wedding invitation felt like a lead weight in my hand, a final, elegant slap in the face. James Wellington requests the honor of your presence as he unites with Veronica Ashford. The paper was thick, expensive, and smelled of the life James had always craved. A life that apparently didn't have room for a girl like me. "Seo-yun, put that thing in the shredder where it belongs," Riley said, her voice cutting through the silence of our cramped apartment. She was watching me with that look of pity I'd grown to loathe over the last 6 months. I ignored her, my thumb tracing the sharp edges of the card. My shift at the warehouse had ended an hour ago, and my back was a dull roar of pain, but the ache in my chest was sharper. "He wants me to see it, Riley. He wants me to stand in the back and realize I was just a stepping stone. 3 years, Seo-yun. You gave him 3 years, supported him while he climbed that corporate ladder, and the second he reached the Ashford circle, he traded you in like an old model," Riley snapped, pacing the small kitchen. She wasn't wrong. James hadn't even had the decency to look me in the eye. I was halfway through a 12-hour shift when the text arrived. "I've outgrown our world, Seo-yun. I need a partner who matches the pedigree of my future. I hope you understand." I hadn't understood. Not until a week later when I saw him on the news, draped in the Ashford family's prestige, looking at Veronica like she was the crown jewel he'd finally won. For 6 months I'd been the disposable ex, the girl who wasn't enough for the Wellington ambition. I'd spent every night wondering what was so fundamentally lacking in my bloodline that 3 years of love could be erased by a single, cold message. I was closing up the shop 2 nights before the ceremony, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, when the heavy glass door creaked open. I didn't even look up as I wiped the counter. "We're closed," I muttered. "I'm not here for a service, Ms. Jang. I'm here with an offer." I looked up and the air left the room. The man standing there was a shadow brought to life, sharp, dark-haired, and radiating a level of absolute authority that didn't belong in a place like this. His eyes didn't just look at me. They scanned me, calculating my worth with the precision of a man who owned the city. This was Juno Kong, and in that moment, I realized the world James was so desperate to join was nothing compared to the one that had just walked through my door. The man didn't move, yet he seemed to occupy every inch of the cramped shop. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire 4-year degree, a deep charcoal wool that drank the weak light of the overhead fluorescence. His presence was an affront to the grease-stained counters and the smell of stale coffee. "The shop is closed," I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. I gripped the plastic handle of the spray bottle, my knuckles white. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the linoleum. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes dark, sharp, and impossibly cold, tracing the line of my jaw, then moving down to the name tag pinned to my faded apron. "Seo-yun Jang," he said. The way he pronounced my name was different from how James used to say it. James had always rounded the vowels to make it sound more palatable, more Western. This man said it with a crisp, native precision that made my heart skip a beat. "I'm not here to sell you anything, Ms. Jang. I'm here because I've been watching you." A chill that had nothing to do with the night air swept over me. Watching me. Is that supposed to be a threat? A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Observation is a business necessity. I know that 6 months ago, you were the top of your class in textile design. I know you spent 3 years living in the shadow of a man who used your brilliance to secure his own promotions. And I know that 2 nights from now, that same man intends to use your presence at his wedding to cement his new status." I felt exposed, as if he'd reached into my chest and pulled out my most humiliating secrets. "Who are you?" "My name is Juno Kong," he said simply. The name hit me like a physical blow. The Kong Group was a ghost story in the city, a multi-billion-dollar empire rumored to be built on more than just shipping and real estate. They were the old blood, the kind of power that didn't need to shout because everyone was already listening. "And why would a man like you care about a warehouse worker?" I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. Because I have a problem, and you have the fire required to solve it, Juno said, leaning slightly over the counter. The scent of expensive sandalwood and cold rain drifted toward me. My family requires me to be married to a woman of a certain caliber. A woman who cannot be intimidated, who possesses the grace of our heritage and the steel of a survivor. James Wellington believes you are a low-level distraction. I believe you are a queen he was too blind to recognize. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a sleek, black fountain pen and a single sheet of vellum. I am offering you a contract, a disguise if you will. You will arrive at that wedding not as the girl James discarded, but as the wife of Juno Kong. You will wear the emerald of my family, you will walk on my arm, and you will watch as the world James fought so hard to bow to you. I looked at the paper. It wasn't just a fake marriage. It was a total reclamation. But I could see the danger vibrating off him like heat. What's the catch? Men like you don't give away thrones for free. The catch, Juno said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous silk, is that once you step into my world, there is no stepping back. You won't just be pretending to be powerful, Seo-yun. You will be mine. And in my world we don't just seek revenge. We ensure that our enemies never have the courage to stand up again. He held the pen out to me. The fluorescent light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across his face. I thought of James's condescending text. I thought of the way the Ashfords would look down their noses at me. Then I looked at Juno, a man who looked like he could burn the whole city down just to see the sparks. I reached out and took the pen. I don't want to just attend the wedding, I said, my voice hardening. I want to ruin him. Juno's eyes finally sparked with something resembling approval. Then sign. And let's show them exactly what kind of pedigree they've insulted. The transition from the warehouse floor to Juno's private estate felt like crossing a border into a country I wasn't sure I was allowed to inhabit. The air here was different, cooler, scented with cedar and the sterile, sharp edge of wealth. But as I stood in the center of the vast dressing suite, surrounded by racks of silk and structured velvet, I felt the old familiar tremor of inadequacy. James had always pushed me toward beige, toward muted tones and Western silhouettes that made me blend into the background of his corporate mixers. Sophisticated, he'd called it. Quiet, was what he'd meant. Juno stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, the city lights reflecting off his dark suit like a second skin. He didn't look at the racks of designer gowns. He didn't look at the diamonds spread across the vanity. The Ashfords expect you to compete with Victoria on her terms, Juno said, his voice low and resonant in the quiet room. They expect a French label and a desperate attempt to look like you belong in their social register. If you do that, you've already lost. Then what do I wear? I asked, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. He turned then, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't a cold calculation in his eyes. He gestured to a single wooden chest at the end of the room, carved with cranes and lotus flowers. James Wellington wanted you to forget where you came from because your heritage intimidated him. He saw your pedigree as a weakness. I see it as your greatest weapon. He stepped forward and opened the chest. Resting atop layers of acid-free paper was a garment that seemed to pulse with its own light. It was an emerald green hanbok, the silk so heavy and rich it looked like poured liquid. My grandmother wore this when she faced the board of directors after my grandfather was assassinated, Juno said, his gaze fixed on the fabric. It is not just a dress. It is a declaration of sovereignty. As I reached out to touch the silk, the memory of my mother's hands, rough from work but nimble as she embroidered my childhood tunics, washed over me. I had spent 3 years trying to be the westernized partner James demanded, smoothing out my accent and tucking away the vibrant traditions of my family like they were something to be ashamed of. Juno stepped back, giving me the room to breathe. Put it on, Seo-yun. Remind them that while they are busy climbing ladders, you are the one who owns the sky. When I finally emerged from behind the screen, the weight of the silk felt different than the weight of my warehouse apron. The geoggery fit perfectly, the white collar crisp against my skin, and the voluminous emerald skirt flowed around me like a deep, dangerous sea. The intricate gold embroidery along the hem wasn't just decorative. It was a map of power, featuring traditional patterns that signaled a lineage far older and more formidable than the new money the Ashfords bragged about. I looked in the mirror and didn't see the girl who had been dumped via text. I didn't see the waitress with aching feet. I saw a woman whose ancestors had survived wars and built dynasties. Juno walked up behind me, his reflection towering and dark. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat radiating from him. He reached out and handed me a set of traditional hairpins, Billionaire, crafted from jade and silver. "You look like a queen reclaiming her throne," he murmured, his eyes meeting mine in the glass. I slid the pins into my hair, securing the updo. For the first time in 6 months, the hollow ache in my chest was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened resolve. The emerald green wasn't just a color. It was my armor. James wanted to witness my humiliation, but he was about to realize that you don't invite a dragon to a garden party and expect the flowers to survive. "I'm ready," I said, my voice no longer a whisper. Juno offered his arm, his expression one of grim, dark satisfaction. "Then let's go give them a wedding they'll never forget." The car ride toward the Ashford estate was a study in pressurized silence. The interior of the black Maybach felt like a vault, insulated from the city outside, smells of leather and Juno's cold, clean cologne filling the space. I smoothed the heavy silk of my emerald skirt, my fingers trembling slightly. "Stop," Juno said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to command the very air. He didn't look at me, but he reached over, his large hand covering mine, stilling the movement. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to his icy demeanor. "Anxiety is for those who are afraid of the consequences. From this moment on, you are the consequence." I looked at him, the sharp profile of his jaw silhouetted against the passing streetlights. "I've never walked into a room like this, Juno. James always told me to be soft, to be agreeable. He said the Ashfords value discretion above all else." Juno finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath hitch. "James Wellington is a man who plays by the rules because he is terrified of the people who wrote them. He spends his life seeking permission. You are no longer in that world." He leaned closer, the space between us vanishing. "Billionaires like the Ashfords follow rules to protect their status. They hide behind lawyers, boardrooms, and social etiquette. But the Mafia, we are the ones who decide where those lines are drawn. We don't ask for a seat at the table, Sioyan. We own the room, the table, and the air everyone else is breathing." He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw, just below the jade pins in my hair. "When we walk into that marquee, James will try to use his new wife's status to make you feel small. He will expect you to look down, to act like a guest who is lucky to be invited. Instead, I want you to look through him. Not at him, through him. Treat him like a minor inconvenience in a world that already belongs to you. And if they ask questions," I whispered, "about us, about the wedding, you give them nothing but the truth of your presence," Juno replied, his hand dropping back to his lap, though the heat of his touch remained. "You don't need to explain why you are there. The emerald you're wearing carries more weight than the Ashford name ever will. In my world, we don't explain. We execute. If someone offends you, you don't argue. You wait for me to erase the insult. Your only job is to exist as the most powerful woman in that room." He checked his watch, a heavy silver piece that looked like a weapon in its own right. "James thinks he's reaching the pinnacle of his life tonight. He thinks he's finally arrived. He has no idea that by inviting you, he invited the one force that can take it all away." I took a deep breath, feeling the steel in his words begin to fuse with my own resolve. The disguise was no longer just the hanbok or the jewelry. It was the mindset. I wasn't Sarah, the girl who worked double shifts and cried over a text message. I was Sioyan Jiang, the wife of the man who made the rules. I understand, I said, my voice steady and cold. Juno's lips curved into that rare, dangerous sliver of a smile. Good. Because the gates are opening, and James is waiting to show off his upgrade. Let's show him what a real transition looks like. As the car slowed to a halt in front of the massive glowing marquee, the flashbulbs of photographers began to pop like distant gunfire. Juno stepped out first, then reached back to offer me his hand. As I took it and stepped into the light, I didn't look for James. I looked straight ahead, into the heart of the empire we were about to dismantle. The car glided through the Ashford Estate's wrought iron gates, but my mind was still anchored to the leather-bound folder Juno had tucked into the seat pocket moments ago. The weight of the emerald silk felt heavier now, no longer just a costume, but a shroud of something much more permanent. The papers I signed at the penthouse. I began, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. I turned to look at him, seeking the comfort of the contract we'd discussed, the disguise that was supposed to end once the wedding cake was cut. You called it a contract, a legal formality for the disguise to hold up under the Ashford's scrutiny. Juno didn't look away from the window, his profile as sharp and unyielding as the jade pins in my hair. It is a legal formality, Seo-yun. In my world, a lie that can be easily dismantled is a liability. For James Wellington to truly feel the weight of his mistake, he needs to believe that you have ascended to a height he can never reach. A mere mistress or a temporary girlfriend wouldn't suffice. I felt a cold prickle of realization crawl up my spine. I thought back to the document, the thick, cream-colored pages covered in complex legal terminology and dual-language seals. I had been so blinded by the desire for vindication, so fueled by the bitter memory of James's text, that I had trusted Juno's definition of temporary. Juno, I said, my pulse beginning to thrum in my ears. How deep does this disguise go? If someone were to check the public records tomorrow, what would they find? He finally turned to me, his dark eyes unfathomable. The car slowed as we approached the valet, the flashbulbs of the paparazzi beginning to bloom like white flowers in the darkness. They would find that Seo-yun Jang is the legally wedded wife of Juno Kong. The filing was completed 3 hours ago. The air left my lungs. I reached out, steadying myself against the door handle. You married me. For a revenge plot. You tied your empire to a waitress from a warehouse just to ruin a man like James. I tied my empire to a woman who has the steel to stand beside me, he corrected, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous silk. He leaned in, his shadow enveloping me. You think this is just about James? He is the footnote, Seo-yun. This marriage provides me with the stability my family demands, and it provides you with a throne. You signed those papers because you wanted to stop being a victim. I simply ensured that you could never be one again. I looked down at my hands. On my ring finger sat a band of platinum and emerald that I hadn't noticed him slip on during the car ride, or perhaps I had been too lost in the training to realize its permanence. It wasn't a prop. It was a seal. You didn't tell me, I whispered, a mix of terror and a strange dark thrill warring in my chest. You let me believe it was a game. In my world there are no games. Only moves, Juno said, his hand finding mine. His grip was proprietary, warm and absolute. James is waiting to show you his upgrade. He thinks he's marrying into a real estate fortune. He has no idea that he is about to face the woman who legally owns the very ground he's standing on. Are you going to falter now? Or are you going to walk in there and show him what a billionaire's wife looks like? The car door was opened by a white-gloved attendant. The roar of the elite, the scent of expensive lilies, and the judgment of 100 socialites waited just beyond the threshold. I looked at the ring, then at the man beside me, the stranger who had stolen my future to give me a dynasty. I didn't pull my hand away. I tightened my grip on him. I'm not faltering, I said, my voice hardening into the very emerald I wore. If I'm the wife of the Kong Empire, then let's go remind James Wellington why he should have stayed in his own lane. Juno stepped out into the light, pulling me with him into the chaos of the wedding, our lives now inextricably legally bound. The air inside the marquee was a suffocating blend of expensive lilies and the brittle, forced laughter of people who valued appearance over everything else. It was a sea of white cream and champagne, a carefully curated aesthetic designed to scream purity and old money. James had always loved this palette. He said it was the color of people who didn't have to work for a living. As the heavy velvet drapes were pulled back for us, the sound in the room didn't just fade, it died. I felt Juno's arm beneath mine, solid as a mountain, as we stepped onto the white runner. If the wedding was a cloud of pale, forgettable lace, we were the storm. The emerald green of my hanbok was so deep it bordered on black in the shadows, a dark jewel cutting through the wash of pastels like a blade. Beside me, Juno in his charcoal suit looked like a shadow brought to life. His presence radiating a quiet, lethal dominance that made the air feel suddenly thin. We didn't walk, we marched. My eyes were fixed straight ahead, but I could feel the gazes of 100 strangers sticking to us like needles. The whispers started almost immediately, a low, buzzing hiss that followed us down the aisle. Who is she? Is that Silk? Look at the man she's with. I saw James before he saw me. He was standing near the floral arch, adjusting his cufflinks with a smug, practiced grin, leaning in to whisper something to a laughing Victoria. He looked every bit the man he'd sacrificed 3 years of our life to become. Polished, wealthy, and entirely hollow. Then he turned. The change was instantaneous. It was as if someone had physically struck him. His grin didn't just fade. It collapsed. His hands froze on his sleeves, and his eyes, the eyes that had looked at me with so much boredom on the night he sent that text, stretched wide with a mixture of disbelief and genuine visceral terror. He didn't see the waitress he'd discarded. He didn't see the girl who had cried over his ambitions. He saw a woman wrapped in the colors of a dynasty, walking on the arm of a man whose name made the Ashford family's real estate empire look like a lemonade stand. Victoria felt the shift beside him, her head whipping around, her hand flying to her throat as her eyes raked over my emerald skirt. The white of her gown suddenly looked cheap, a costume of innocence compared to the ancient, weighted power of my heritage. Juno didn't slow down. He didn't acknowledge the gasps or the way the crowd parted for us like a retreating tide. He led me toward the front row, his pace deliberate and punishing. Every step I took was a heartbeat, a rhythm of reclamation. The floor beneath my feet wasn't James's territory anymore. It was mine. Breathe, Seoyun, Juno murmured. His voice so low it was only for me. The crown only stays on if you keep your head up. I didn't blink. I reached the front and stopped just feet away from James. Up close, I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. I could see the way his chest hitched, his mouth slightly agape, trying to find words that simply didn't exist in his vocabulary of excuses. I didn't give him a smile. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. I simply looked through him, exactly as Juno had taught me, treating the man who had broken my heart like a piece of debris on an otherwise perfect road. The dark jewel had arrived, and as the first notes of the wedding march began to play, I realized that the music wasn't for the bride. It was for the return of a queen. The silence following our entrance was so brittle it felt as though the slightest movement would shatter it. Juno and I stood motionless, a dark emerald anchor in the center of James's carefully curated white paradise. James was paralyzed. His champagne flute, clutched in a hand that had begun to shake, tilted dangerously. I watched the realization ripple across his face, the slow, agonizing climb from confusion to recognition, and finally, to the sharp, jagged peak of terror. He wasn't just seeing an ex-girlfriend who had cleaned up well. He was looking at a woman who had been resurrected as something he couldn't categorize, standing beside a man whose reputation was a whispered warning in every boardroom James had ever tried to enter. Seo Yun. His voice was a thin, strangled rasp that barely carried over the low hum of the air conditioning. Beside him, Victoria's face was a mask of indignant fury. her hand tightening on James's arm until her knuckles turned the same shade as her ivory dress. She didn't matter. Her world of charity galas and Daddy's real estate empire was a dollhouse compared to the reality Juno occupied. The twist was the moment James's eyes dropped to the emerald on my finger, then back to Juno's possessive hand on my waist. The logic in his ambitious mind was failing him. He had dumped me because I didn't match his pedigree, and here I was, anchored to the apex of power. His grip finally gave out. The champagne flute hit the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline crack. The sound echoed through the marquee like a gunshot, sending a spray of glass and gold liquid across the hem of Victoria's pristine white gown. She let out a sharp, undignified shriek, but James didn't even blink. He didn't look at the mess. He didn't look at his bride. He was staring at Juno, and for the first time I saw the true depth of his cowardice. He knew exactly who Juno Kong was, and he knew that by discarding me, he had unwittingly committed a sin the Kong family didn't forgive. "James," Juno said. His voice a low, terrifyingly calm silk that seemed to resonate in the very floorboards. "You look surprised. I assumed you would be happy to see your old friend Sioyan again. Especially now that she's my wife." The word wife hit James like a physical blow to the stomach. He actually recoiled, his back hitting the floral display behind him. The guests, who had been hovering on the edges of the scene, let out a collective, sharp intake of breath. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was an avalanche. "Your wife," James stammered, his face draining of all color until he looked like a ghost in his own tuxedo. That's not possible. She's just a..." "What, James?" I interrupted, my voice as cold and clear as the glass at his feet. I stepped forward, the emerald silk of my hanbok whispering against the floor. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to be angry. The terror in his eyes was the only apology I would ever need. A waitress, a distraction, or were you going to say someone who didn't match your ambitions? I turned my gaze to Juno, allowing a small, calculated smile to touch my lips, the first show of emotion since we'd entered. "It's a shame, darling. I thought James had better taste in decor. All this white. It's so easy to stain." Juno's eyes sparked with a dark, predatory approval. He looked at James not as a rival, but as an insect he was deciding whether or not to crush. "I think we've seen enough, Sioyan. The smell of desperation is becoming quite taxing." As we turned to leave the wreckage of his composure behind, I didn't look back. I didn't need to see the way Victoria was shouting at the trembling waiters or how James had slumped into a chair. His big day, reduced to a pile of broken glass and public ruin. The best revenge wasn't just showing him what he'd lost. It was watching him realize that the woman he thought was nothing was now the only person who could save him, and she was already walking away. The chaos following the sound of shattering glass felt like a physical weight settling over the marquee. While the waitresses scrambled to clean the mess and the guests whispered behind manicured hands, I stood perfectly still, watching the foundation of James's new life crack in real time. Veronica Ashford wasn't looking at the broken glass near her feet or the gold liquid ruining the lace of her five-figure gown. She was looking at James. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, raked over the man she had just pledged her life to, a man who was currently trembling, his face a sickly shade of gray as he stared at Juno Kang's shoes. "James!" Veronica's voice was no longer the soft, melodic tone of a bride. It was the voice of a woman who had realized she had made a very expensive mistake. "Why are you shaking? And why is this man talking to you as if he owns the ground you're standing on?" James tried to swallow, but his throat seemed to have closed up. "Veronica, it's a misunderstanding. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" she snapped, her volume rising just enough to draw the attention of her father, the real estate mogul, who was already making his way toward us with a look of thunderous disapproval. "That your disposable ex was married to a man who could buy and sell our entire family by noon? Or that you were too much of a coward to tell me the truth?" Juno didn't let her finish. He stepped forward, his presence so absolute that Veronica actually took a step back, her indignation faltering. He didn't look at her. He looked at her father. "Mr. Ashford," Juno said. His voice a low, lethal silk that carried across the hushed room. "Your new son-in-law has a habit of miscalculating the value of things. He thought he could use my wife as a stepping stone to your daughter's fortune. I find that level of disrespect intolerable." Mr. Ashford's face went from angry to terrified in a matter of seconds. He knew the Kong name. He knew that a single phone call from Juno could freeze the Ashford credit lines and halt every construction project they had in the city. "Mr. Kong," the older man stammered, his bravado vanishing. "I had no idea. If there has been any offense." The offense was committed the moment James Wellington believed he could walk into this room with his head held high after what he did to Seo-yun, Juno interrupted. He turned back to James, his eyes cold and predatory. "From this moment, James is a liability to the Ashford name. I expect the business community to be notified of his resignation from all positions by morning." James finally found his voice, though it was a pathetic, high-pitched sound. "You can't do that. This is my wedding." Juno leaned in, his shadow completely eclipsing the groom. "This isn't a wedding anymore, James. It's a funeral for your ambitions. Consider the glass on the floor a metaphor for your career." Veronica looked at James, seeing the sweat on his lip and the way he couldn't meet Juno's eyes. With a look of pure, unadulterated disgust, she ripped her hand away from his arm. She didn't say a word. She simply turned her back on him and walked toward her father, leaving the groom standing alone in the middle of his own ruined celebration. The dominance Juno exerted wasn't just over James. It was over the entire event. He had dismantled a marriage and a corporate alliance with nothing more than a few sentences. "We're finished here," Juno said, turning to me. He offered his arm again, his expression softening into something that looked dangerously like pride. I took it, feeling the weight of the emerald on my finger and the sudden, incredible lightness in my soul. As we walked out of the marquee, the elite guests didn't just part for us. They bowed. James was left behind, a shadow in a white room, realizing too late that the woman he'd discarded was the only power he'd ever truly known. The silence of the Maybach was different now. It was no longer the heavy, pressurized quiet of two soldiers going into battle. It was the soft, ringing stillness that followed a landslide. Outside, the blurred lights of the city streaked past the tinted windows, but inside the cabin, the only light came from the dim blue glow of the dashboard and the occasional flash of a street lamp catching the emerald on my finger. I looked down at the ring, the deep green stone shimmering with a cold, liquid fire. The weight of it felt more real than the silk of my hanbok, more permanent than the legal filing I had only just discovered. I waited for the panic to set in, for the realization that I had traded one cage for another, but it didn't come. Instead, there was only a strange, grounded warmth. "You're very quiet," Juno said. I turned to see him watching me. He had discarded his suit jacket, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that looked as though they were forged from steel. The lethal, dominant mask he had worn in the marquee had softened, replaced by an expression of quiet, exhausted intensity. "I'm just realizing that the world I lived in an hour ago doesn't exist anymore," I murmured. I looked at him, searching for the shadow billionaire I had met in the warehouse, but I found someone else. Someone who looked like he was finally breathing for the first time in a long time. "The contract. The filing. You didn't just give me a disguise, Juno. You gave me a life." He leaned back against the leather seat, his eyes never leaving mine. "I gave you the tools, Seo-yun. You were the one who walked into that room and took what was yours. I've seen men with decades of experience falter under the Ashford scrutiny, yet you treated them like they were nothing. That wasn't the contract speaking. That was you." "But it's legal," I said, the word tasting like a secret. "We aren't just partners in a revenge plot. We're bound." Juno reached out, not with the proprietary grip he'd used for the cameras, but with a slow, deliberate gentleness. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the line of the emerald. In my world, everything is a transaction until it isn't. I needed a wife who wouldn't break, and you needed a man who wouldn't leave you in the shadows. But tonight, watching you stand in that emerald silk, I realized I didn't want a business partner. I wanted the woman who had the courage to look into the abyss and demand it bowed to her. I felt a sudden sharp pull in my chest, a connection that went far deeper than a signature on a vellum sheet. James had wanted me to be small, to be palatable. Juno wanted me to be a storm. The Ashfords will come for us, I warned, though the fear felt distant, almost academic. And James? He won't go quietly into the night. Let them come, Juno said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous silk that made my pulse race. He leaned closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain wrapping around me. They are billionaires who follow rules. We are the ones who make them. As long as you are by my side, there isn't a power in this city that can touch you. He didn't kiss me. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me, with a respect that bordered on reverence, was more intimate than anything I had ever experienced with James. For the first time in my life, I wasn't a stepping stone or a distraction. I was a partner. I was a queen. The car slowed as we approached the private entrance to his penthouse. The disguise of the evening was over, but as I looked at our intertwined hands, I knew the real story was only just beginning. We were no longer playing a part. We were building a dynasty. Welcome home, Seo-yun, he whispered as the valet opened the door. I stepped out into the cool night air, the emerald green of my dress catching the moonlight. I wasn't looking back at the wreckage of the wedding. I was looking at the man beside me, and for the first time, the future didn't look like a threat. It looked like a kingdom. The penthouse was silent, save for the soft rustle of the wind against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the air felt charged with a new, permanent electricity. I stood before the mirror, slowly unpinning the jade biniou from my hair. The emerald silk of the hanbok pooled around my feet like a captured tide. 6 months ago, I was a woman defined by what I had lost. Tonight, as the city lights of Seoul stretched out beneath me like a carpet of diamonds, I was defined by what I had claimed. Juno appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the hallway. He had discarded his tie, and the top buttons of his shirt were undone, but the aura of absolute authority remained. He didn't just walk into a room. He commanded the space within it. He watched me for a moment, his gaze lingering on the way the moonlight caught the emerald on my finger, the ring that was no longer a prop, but a seal of a new dynasty. The Ashfords released a statement an hour ago, he said, his voice a low, resonant silk. James has been stripped of his positions. The marriage is being annulled quietly. They are scrubbed from the social register by morning. I turned to face him, the weight of the evening finally settling not as exhaustion, but as a cold, sharpened clarity. And us. The world now knows Seo-yun Jang is the wife of the Kong heir. There is no going back to the warehouse. There is no going back to being invisible. Juno stepped into the room, his presence warm and proprietary. He reached out, his fingers grazing the silk at my shoulder before settling on the nape of my neck. Why would you want to go back? You were never meant for the shadows, Seo-yun. You were meant to be the light that people either follow or fear. He led me to the window, pointing down at the sprawl of the city. James wanted to match his ambitions. He reached for a real estate empire and thought he'd reached the summit. He had no idea that while he was looking at the buildings, we were looking at the foundation. This city, this empire. It isn't just mine anymore. It's ours. The realization hit me then, deeper than any legal filing or public confrontation. The disguise had been a cocoon. The emerald hanbok wasn't a costume I was wearing to trick my enemies. It was the skin I was meant to inhabit. I looked at Juno, the man who had recognized the fire in a weary waitress and fanned it into a blaze. He wasn't just my husband by contract or by law. He was the first person to truly see me. A dynasty isn't built on names alone, I murmured, leaning back against the solid strength of his chest. It's built on loyalty. And on never forgetting who tried to burn the house down. Exactly, Juno whispered, his lips brushing my temple. The world thinks they saw a scandal tonight. What they actually saw was the birth of a new era. Tomorrow the board will meet. They will expect to see a trophy wife. Instead, they will see the woman who dismantled the Ashfords in a single night. I looked out at the horizon, where the dark sky was just beginning to catch the first faint violet of dawn. I wasn't the girl who had been broken by a text message. I wasn't a victim seeking a moment of petty revenge. I was Seoyeon Jangkung, the architect of my own destiny and the sovereign of a shadow empire. The revenge was over. The reign had begun.